All right, so today we're taking a deep dive into a career path. Well, one that might not be on everyone's radar. Bindery operators. I'll admit, when I first heard about it, I was picturing, staplers and glue, not exactly the most thrilling stuff. But then digging into this RoleCatcher guide you sent over, well, let's just say it opened my eyes a bit. What do you think?
You hit the nail on the head when you mentioned not on everyone's radar. It's fascinating how this role, it's all about precision, taking something as ordinary as paper and transforming it. Like the source uses this phrase, order and structure, which sounds pretty straightforward, right? But then you think about the scale of it. We're talking thousands of books, magazines, reports, all those things we rely on daily. It takes on a whole new meaning.
It's easy to forget the skill involved in those everyday things. We just take it for granted. But like you said, it's a craft. This RoleCatcher guide breaks down the scope of their work, and it's not just operating machinery.
No, not at all.
There's troubleshooting, quality control, even calibrating equipment. They're really owning that entire process.
It's funny you mentioned that. The source actually emphasizes that problem-solving aspect. It's not just about running a machine, it's about ensuring the entire production runs smoothly. They're like the guardians of that process, making sure everything comes out perfectly bound.
That makes sense. So it's less about being a button pusher and more about being, well, a problem solver in a way.
Exactly.
And that probably means they're working in a pretty demanding environment, right?
Yeah.
What kind of setting are we talking about here?
Yeah, so the source doesn't sugarcoat it. It can be noisy. You might be dealing with heavy machinery, so protective gear is a must. Physically demanding is an understatement, but, and this is key for anyone considering this path, there's potential for overtime pay, which, let's be honest, is a pretty nice perk these days.
Definitely a good thing to keep in mind.
Yeah.
Now, speaking of practical considerations, what's the job outlook like for bindery operators? I mean, is this a field with a future?
Well, that's where it gets interesting. While automation is, changing the game for a lot of industries, and we'll dive into that a bit later, it's not replacing human workers entirely. In fact, the RoleCatcher guide actually projects an increase in job opportunities. Why? Because as technology advances, you need skilled operators who can adapt and manage those machines.
So it's not man versus machine, it's more like man with machine.
Precisely. You've got it.
So learning to work alongside those new technologies becomes really key.
Absolutely. And that's where things get really interesting when we start talking about career progression in this field. Because the source goes into some really cool specializations, and that's where you see the potential for growth.
Okay, so when we talk about specializations, what are we actually talking about? I mean, can you give us some concrete examples of how a bindery operator might specialize?
Oh, absolutely. Think about all the different types of bound materials out there. We've got books, magazines, brochures, even packaging. The RoleCatcher guide specifically mentions things like saddle stitching, which is super common for magazines and booklets.
Right, I've seen that.
And then there's perfect binding, which is often used for paperback books and thicker documents. Each of these techniques requires different equipment, different skills. It's pretty cool.
So you could go from, say, binding a stack of reports to working on a limited edition hand-bound book. That's a pretty wild range.
It really is. It's like its own little universe of binding out there.
It is. Okay,
Yeah.
so you've got these specializations, but how do those translate into actual career growth? Can you really climb the ladder in this field?
That's where the RoleCatcher guide gets really helpful because they've got this whole section on career stages. And what's interesting is it's not just about moving from one machine to another. They actually highlight a shift in mindset and responsibility as you progress.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
All
So
right.
walk us through some of those stages. How do those responsibilities change as you move up?
All right, imagine you're an entry-level operator, right? You're probably focused on mastering the basics, assisting the more experienced operators. Maybe you're doing a lot of quality checks, making sure everything's up to snuff.
Right, like an apprenticeship almost.
Exactly, you're learning the ropes, paying your dues. But then, as you gain more experience, you move up to, say, a junior operator role. Now you're setting up machines independently, you're troubleshooting problems, maybe even training some of those newer hires.
Right, so it's not just about getting faster at binding. It's about really understanding those machines, taking ownership.
You got it. And then as you continue to progress, you might become a lead operator, which means you're responsible for an entire production line. You're managing schedules, you're the quality control expert, you're mentoring junior staff. It's a whole other level.
Wow, so you've gone from apprentice to, like, the master.
Nicely.
It's a huge jump in responsibility. But how do you actually demonstrate those skills to potential employers? Like, how do you prove that you've leveled up?
That's where certifications come in. And the RoleCatcher guide, it really highlights how crucial these certifications are improving your expertise.
Makes sense.
It's one thing to say, hey, I'm proficient in saddle stitching, but having that industry recognized certification, that carries weight.
Right. It's like that extra level of, okay, they're not just winging it. They've actually invested in learning this stuff.
Yeah.
Does RoleCatcher actually point you towards those certifications?
They do. They have this whole section called Knowledge and Learning, and it's full of links to relevant certification programs, industry events, even networking opportunities. It's really cool. They really want to empower you to take control of your career path.
That's awesome. Now, speaking of empowerment, I've got to ask about their interview prep resources, because that's something that always stresses people out.
Yeah, interviews can be a nerve-wracking experience. So how does RoleCatcher help you prepare?
What's cool about this resource is it's not just generic interview advice. They actually have questions specifically tailored for aspiring bindery operators.
Okay, so what kind of questions are we talking about? Give us some examples. Well, they could ask something like, describe your experience with different types of binding equipment, really testing your knowledge there. Or how would you troubleshoot a jamming issue on a perfect binding machine? Putting you on the spot. And then, of course, safety is paramount. So they might ask, how do you ensure a safe working environment around heavy machinery?
Wow, they've really thought of everything. It's like having a cheat sheet for the interview.
Right. Talk about a confidence booster.
So for our listener who's been glued to this deep dive, what are the key takeaways about a career as a bindery operator?
First and foremost, this isn't your grandma's dusty old bindery. It's a skilled trade with a bright future. We're talking precision, problem solving, producing tangible products.
Right, and not just pushing buttons, but really understanding the ins and outs of those machines.
Exactly. As technology evolves, those skills are only going to become more valuable.
And the second big takeaway, there's room for growth. You can start as an entry-level operator and work your way up to a lead operator role, managing a whole team.
Absolutely. There's a real career path here if you're willing to put in the work. Now, you mentioned earlier the whole digital revolution and what it means for printed materials. I know some people might be wondering, is there even a place for bindery operators in a digital world?
It's a fair question.
Well,
What does the RoleCatcher guide say about that?
it does acknowledge that there might be a decline in traditional printed materials. But, and this is key, they also emphasize that bindery operators work with unprinted paper as well.
Oh, that's right.
Things like packaging, brochures, marketing materials, all those things still need to be bound.
And often in really creative and intricate ways.
Exactly. So even in a digital age, those skills are still very much in demand.
It's all about adapting, finding new ways to apply those core skills. So for our listener out there who's intrigued by a hands-on career, one that combines creativity, technical expertise, and even a bit of artistry, don't write off the world of bindery operators just yet.
You might be surprised by what you discover. It's a fascinating blend of tradition and technology.
And who knows, you might find yourself binding the next bestseller or creating a beautiful, one-of-a-kind piece that someone will treasure for years to come.
Now that's something to be proud of.
It's about more than just paper and glue. It's about making your mark, one perfectly bound page at a time. That's it for a deep dive today. As always, thanks for joining us.